David Shapiro here with eXp Realty. I'm joined by Justin Boyd of JVM Lending, and we are going to talk about some of the tax changes and how it affects the standard deduction. We've seen some big changes here to the tax law, so why don't you tell us a little bit more about how this is going to affect buyers?
So David, first of all, let's talk about the change. The standard deduction has now been moved to $12,000 for single filers and $24,000 for joint filers.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting change. I think most people see it as a benefit because most people were taking the standard deduction. I actually saw that at this point, now it's going to be 90% of borrowers or people are just going to take the standard deduction. So it's a huge percentage of the population that own homes. I work with a lot of self-employed people, so we're going to talk also about how that affects people that are self-employed, because I think the standard deduction is definitely more geared towards employees. But let's start with talking about employees.
Yeah, so the reality is that the only way you receive a deduction for mortgage interest paid is if you itemize your deduction. If you're taking the standard deduction, you receive absolutely no benefit from paying mortgage interest.
And I have a calculator, so when I sit down with buyers for the first time and we look at the numbers and they try to understand the full picture, there's a couple of things we look at, and one of them is what can they expect to gain as a benefit from the mortgage interest deduction. And one of the things that they need to know when we sit down, and usually they don't, and it's fine, they can go talk to their accountant or look at their tax return from the previous year, was if they were to itemize, what would that be? And then we can take a look at the numbers and see if itemizing in the current year, whatever year that would be that they're buying, if that's going to start to save them some additional money on their taxes. And what we're seeing is that depending on the price point, it may or may not. So do you want to touch upon that?
Yeah, let's go through an example. So David, if a couple bought a $600,000 home with 20% down, their total deductions for the year with mortgage interest and property taxes might be in the $30,000 range. Mm-hmm. This is only $6,000 higher than the standard deduction, making the tax benefits from buying marginal at best. If that couple's in a 30% tax bracket, they might only save $1,200 in income tax due to the fact that they bought a home. Another important thing to note in Texas, because our property taxes are so high, with the limit on the state and local tax deduction being $10,000, anytime you buy a home over $500,000, give or take, the property taxes won't be deductible over that amount.
One thing that people should be aware of is that if they are getting a mortgage interest deduction, let's just say it's $15,000, that's a deduction against the amount that they're being taxed on. So it's not a tax credit. They're not getting $15,000 back in their pocket. They're getting $15,000 in lower taxable, their taxable income is being lowered by 15 grand, and then you multiply that by their tax bracket to figure out what the benefit to them, bottom line dollars is. And if a single buyer is buying the same $600,000 house that we were talking about, they actually enjoy a larger benefit because they have a lower standard deduction. So they're only getting a $12,000 standard deduction, so there's actually potentially more of an impact on the same size home purchase. Something to take into account for those people that are single. Let's talk a little bit about self-employed buyers, because a little bit of a different animal. Generally, they're already itemizing, so they're going to see more benefit from the mortgage interest deduction and the state tax deduction. So they can deduct up to $10,000 of state income taxes. So that's where you came up with that $500,000 mark, because generally taxes here in the Austin area around 2.2%. So that's where that benefit maxes out. And then the mortgage interest deduction maxes out at a $750,000 loan amount. So, if they're in that $500,000 price range, they can get a ton of benefit. And I think depending on their lifestyle, they shouldn't limit it based on these numbers, because there's still some big benefits to owning in addition to these two. One of the ones that I love is that it's a hedge against inflation. And I actually gave a talk at a conference one time, and the talk was why your goal should be to accumulate $1 million in debt. And people were like, this guy's out of his mind. Well, why should we be accumulating debt? I think people have this thing drilled in their head about why they shouldn't have debt, and they work so hard to pay it down so quickly. And there are types of debt that are bad debt that you should be doing that with. High interest rate credit cards, for sure. You should have something at 12, 14, 18% that you're paying on. That should be paid down quickly. But a mortgage or a student loan, that's generally at 6% or lower, you can hang on to that all day. If somebody who's willing to loan me money at 6%, I will take that infinite amount and be able to invest it and get a higher return. So you should look at that the same way. And some people have a little bit of a hard time with like the marginal, hey, well, I just want to pay an extra $200 a month towards my loan. That's going to save me tens of thousands over the 30 years. That's possibly, that is true, but probably you're not going to own it for 30 years. That's A. B, if you take that $200 and invest that, even just the stock market, my investment vehicle of choice is real estate. But let's just use the stock market for an easy example, because you can invest marginally at $200 a month and put that into the stock market. I'm pretty confident you can get better than a 6% return. And so theoretically, you should take that gap and not pay down your mortgage any quicker than you can. It also acts as a hedge against inflation. And the way that works is that if you have $1 million in cash sitting in the bank, is inflation good or bad for that $1 million in cash?
Terrible.
Yeah, it's just eroding the value of that over time. So what's the opposite of cash? It's debt. So if you have $1 million in debt, then now all of a sudden inflation is good for you. So my goal is to have a lot of debt, because inflation, the Fed has a target inflation rate of between 2 and 3%. So literally the government is targeting to have inflation. And I think the federal government is, the biggest entity, United States federal government. It'd probably be good to align yourselves with their interests. The amount of debt that the federal government has, there's no way they're going to get out of it. One of the only ways is through inflation. So I'm confident that we're going to continue to see inflation. And so having debt is an important way to hedge against that. And so my goal is $1 million in debt, and I'm talking about low rate, fixed interest. And that's another thing. While interest rates are currently at historic lows, my first loan was 6.25%, and it was an ARM, adjustable rate mortgage, meaning that after the 5-year mark, every year it adjusted. And it could go up to, I think, as high as 10.25%. The fact that you can get a sub 5% 30-year fixed rate mortgage right now is crazy. And people look back, well, I could have gone 4%. What was that, a year or 2 years ago?
Right.
I mean, we're still at historic lows, and still 5% is a great interest rate and a great way to hedge against inflation. The other benefit that you're getting by having debt is you're automatically paying down your loan balance every month. And that's just a really cool way to build wealth. And even if you don't get any appreciation, you're paying down the loan.
I think a great point to make, David, is not only debt great for inflation or a hedge against inflation, debt backed by real estate. That's an important distinction. When you've got an asset, an underlying asset that's securing the debt, when we're seeing rates of inflation, we're seeing appreciation in property values as well. And I think one of my favorite quotes from Warren Buffett is that the only way to build true wealth is with other people's money.
OPM. They've got an acronym for it. Yeah, totally in agreement, and thank you for adding that. That, yeah, you're also seeing the appreciation of real estate. And some markets across the country haven't seen drastic appreciation like we have in Austin. I foresee that this is only going to continue. We still have amazing job growth here in Austin, and that's bringing more jobs, and that's why people continue to come. And there's just not enough supply in the city. I know people see developments going up all around town, and they're thinking, oh my gosh, there's so much. But we literally, even with all the developments going on, we can't keep up with the demand. That's why prices continue to rise, despite the fact that developers continue to build. In summary, there's still a lot of benefits to owning when it comes to taxes and deductions, but they're very nuanced. So for your individual situation, I recommend that you reach out to me and to Justin, and we can together help you look at your situation and give you a detailed analysis of how much this is actually going to save you. What does it look like for you? Of course, these decisions often have to do with lifestyle. So if it's time to buy a home, your family's growing, you need more space, this is just a factor in it, and maybe it impacts like, hey, I could spend a little bit more than I thought I could because I'm getting a little bit more of a benefit on the tax side, and that's good to know up front going into it so you have the full picture. But of course, this isn't the reason to buy or not to buy, just one of the things to consider. So Justin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, David.
Yeah, you're welcome. And if there's anything else that you want to know about lending real estate, reach out to us. Our contact info is below. Also, please leave comments, questions, and we'll get on there and answer as well.